everybody, the Pop Music Freak is back. I have another video. I'm continuing my countdown series of the biggest hits of each decade. We're up to the 1970s, a decade close to my heart, my childhood years. The good old tunes of the 70s. We're doing the top 100 songs from the 70s, and of course, got to throw in number 101 because I always feel sorry for the song that just misses. So we're going to go through the countdown now, starting with number 101. The song is Lay Down Sally by Eric Clapton. Was a number 3 hit in 1978. Spent the whole month at number 3 and spent numerous amount of weeks in the top 10. Gained enough points to slide into slot number 101 of the 1970s. Next, song number 100 is the first hit for an American group of army brats who grew up actually in England. They are the group Ymca. First single they released at the very beginning of 1972 was A Horse with No Name. It went on to spend 3 weeks at number 1 and was ranked number 100 for the whole entire decade of the 70s. Next, number 99. We have Gerry Rafferty, former lead singer of Steelers Wheel. Gerry Rafferty, first solo single he released was Baker Street, rocketed up the charts all the way to number 2. It spent 6 weeks at number 2, but it never reached number 1 because Shadow Dancing by Indy Gibb was in front of it the whole time at number 1. We'll talk about Shadow Dancing later in our countdown. But Baker Street was a big record for Gerry Rafferty in the summer of 78 and ranked at number 99 for the 70s. Next, my friends, number 98, Vicki Lawrence, The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia from 1973. She was a regular on the Carol Burnett Show and ended up becoming somewhat famous of her own for her comedy, and she actually looked quite a bit like Carol Burnett. Which is part of why she got hired to be on that show. She was really not a serious singer. This is basically a knockoff record that she put out, and it ended up being tremendously successful, going to number 1 for 2 weeks. So that's number 98 of the 70s. Number 97 is also from 1973. It was the second number 1 hit for Helen Reddy. She first hit number 1 with I Am Woman in December of 1972. In September of 73, she hit number 1 with Delta Dawn, which is ranked at number 97 for the decade. It was a big hit, but came out same time as Let's Get It On by Marvin Gaye. So Marvin Gaye got ahead of it and got into number 1 ahead of Delta Dawn. But Delta Dawn was on the charts for a while, long enough to rank number 97 on our list. Okay, number 96, we have Charlie Rich, The Silver Fox, and The Most Beautiful Girl, which hit number 1 in December of 1973. He had a pretty decent run of country crossover and pop hits around the 73 to 75 period. This was his biggest hit he ever had, The Most Beautiful Girl. So, and that's number 96. Next, we have number 95, Minnie Riperton, the late Minnie Riperton, and Lovin' You, one of the most beautiful love songs from the 70s or any decade, in my opinion. Just a beautiful record. It was from 1975. It was ranked to number 95 for the decade of the 70s. Next, number 94, we have the Bee Gees and Jive Talking. They're kind of a comeback hit. It was basically their second comeback, as the brothers split up in 1969 and all recorded separately. None of them really had much success at that time. They decided to get back together at the end of 1970, started charting again, having some hits including Lonely Days and How Can You Mend a Broken Heart, which is in this top 100 countdown. We'll get to that later. Had a couple more hits in 72, and then they kind of fizzled out after that, flopped. The next 2 albums flopped, and they decided to change their sound to go more into an R&B disco direction. And by 1975, and Jive Talking was their comeback, basically their first song with this new sound, and obviously it ranked number 94 for the decade, so it was a smashing success indeed. Jive Talking from August of 75. Next, we have Dionne Warwicke and the Spinners teaming up for Then Came You, which hit number 1 in October of 1974. That is ranked number 93 on our list. It ended up spending a good long time in the top 10 until it finally fizzled out. But it was a big comeback for Dionne Warwicke, who hadn't had a hit since 1970. And the Spinners were red hot at that time on Atlantic Records. Every song was either a pop or R&B hit for them. So this was a good team up indeed. All right, next we have number 92 of the 70s. It's the Silver Convention and Fly Robin Fly. Would spend 3 weeks at number 1 in November into December of 1975. Part of the early disco run that started to really heat up at this point. Silver Convention were a German group. They would have another big hit with Get Up and Boogie, that's right, which is also in this countdown. So that's Silver Convention at number 92, Fly, Robin, Fly. Next, my friends, number 91, the Red Hot in the mid-70s, Elton John, the hottest artist on the charts at this period. Island Girl would be his, fifth number 1 hit in a 2-year period. He would have Crocodile Rock, he would have Benny and the Jets, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Philadelphia Freedom, which is in this countdown, and Island Girl would be the 5th number 1. He would also hit with Don't Go Breaking My Heart, which is later in this countdown as well in 1976. But he was just a man on a mission. And so he was Island Girl, spent 3 weeks at the top in November of 75. Song number 91 for the decade. Next, my friends, number 90, we have Marilyn, Mccool, and Billy Davis Jr. with You Don't Have to Be a Star to Be in My Show. This was the first solo release for them after leaving the Fifth Dimension and deciding to continue on as just a married couple recording together. It would be their one huge hit outside of the group. They had a follow-up song called Your Love a few months later that hit number 15. But this was the big one, January 1977, number 90 for the decade of the 70s. All right, song number 89, Barbra Streisand and Neil Diamond, You Don't Bring Me Flowers from 1978. They had both recorded this song individually, and some enterprising DJ decided to splice the two vocals together and just to see what it would sound like, and he thought it sounded amazing enough that it caught fire at this radio station. And some other radio stations wanted to start playing this spliced version. Columbia Records at the time decided it was so good we better get the two of them back in the studio and record it together. Turned into a big number 1 hit in December 1978. It was number 89 for the decade. Next, number 88, we have Donna Summer and MacArthur Park, a remake of the Richard Harris hit from 1968 with a disco beat. Spent 3 weeks at the top, November 1978. Donna Summer was starting to become very red hot at that time. In fact, this was her first number 1. So number 88, MacArthur Park. Next, number 87, Billy Paul and Me and Mrs. Jones. One of the biggest hits on Philly International Records. Hit number 1 for 3 weeks. Reached number 1 final week of 1972. Stayed number 1 first 2 weeks of January 1973. Billy Paul's only really big hit on the pop chart. He did have a couple of R&B hits afterwards, but this was his big one, number 87 for the decade. Next, number 86, we have the Osmonds, and their debut hit, One Bad Apple, would be their biggest hit, going to number 1 and spending 5 weeks there in February of 1971. The brothers would continue to have several hits into the first half of the 70s, and of course Donnie had some hits and Marie had some hits as well. So the family was pretty successful. It kind of copied the line, similar line as the Jacksons, who had big hits as a group, and as certain members as solo artists also had hits, obviously. So there we are with that, number 86 for the decade. Next, number 85, we have the Spinners and the Rubber Band Man. A big number 2 hit in November into December of 1976. probably the last big hit from Atlantic in the 70s. They would have two hits in 1980. But they were one of the big R&B bands of the 70s. They had a huge run throughout the whole decade. And this was their most blatant disco song, and it was a big hit, the biggest they had, actually, of the 70s. Okay, that's number 85. Next, my friends, we're at number 84. It's a Steve Miller Band and the Joker. That hit number 1 in January of 1974. Would be the first big hit for the band. Interesting story about Steve Miller is he had a big accident. He was locked in the hospital for a good amount of time, close to 6 months, with some serious injuries. He recovered from them. He had plenty of time to write. He ended up writing basically the whole album from the hospital bed, including the Joker, and ended up being the big breakthrough for him, even though he had been recording going back to 1967. They didn't have any hit records until this point. But this was a big one for him. His first number 1, the Joker, number 84 for the 1970s. Next, we're at number 83, Harry Nilsson and Without You. Song that would spend 4 weeks at number 1, early in February into March of 1972. Story with this album is Richard Perry was his producer and was really pushing him to go in a more serious pop music direction. The vocal performance on the song is absolutely incredible, as we all know. Just a huge record. The issue was trying to follow it up. He was not serious about having a long stretch of hit records in his career. And he was hell to deal with in the recording studio. That is what the story is. And then his habits, unfortunately, got the best of him and shortened his career and probably shortened his life as well. But there is Harry Nilsson at number 83 with Without You. Okay, next, number 82, we have Carl Douglas and Kung Fu Fighting. Another big-time novelty early disco record that just took off. Spending 2 weeks at number 1 in December of 1974. He would never have another top 40 hit after it, but the song certainly catapulted the whole disco movement forward at the time. All right. Next, we're up to number 81 of the 70s. It's Diana Ross and Touch Me in the Morning from 1973, August of 73. It hit number 1. It was her second solo number 1 after Ain't No Mountain High Enough in 1970. And she had a good run. She also was appearing in movies. Lady Sings the Blues. She was in that movie at the very beginning of 73. She would be in the movie Mahogany a couple of years later. So she was someone that was, multi-talented and was pretty much on a good run through the 70s, besides her years with the Supremes. So that's number 81, Touch Me in the Morning. Next, number 80, we have the Bee Gees, their first number 1 hit from 1971, How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? It was written during their first initial breakup period. Thankfully, they came back together and had a run of hits, including this song, and then would have a little downturn, like I mentioned, and then would have their huge disco years in the second half of the 70s. So that's the Bee Gees at number 80. Next, we have number 79, Freddie Fender, Before the Next Teardrop Falls, from 1975, end of May of 75. Story with him is he was a Mexican recording artist in the late 50s. He was very much a part of the early rock and roll scene. Then he kind of got himself into a little bit of trouble and ended up going to prison for several years. I think it was armed robbery. It was robbery. And during those years, he was still writing. He was still performing in prison and waiting for the day to get back out on his own. Once he got out, someone decided to take a chance with him and saw his talent and signed him to a contract, and he ended up having this humongous hit in May of 75 and had a few more hits the rest of that year going into 76, then kind of fizzled out after that. but he had a good run, and is always going to be known for this song, Before the Next Teardrop Falls. Number 79 on the list. Next, number 78, The Silver Convention and Get Up and Boogie, That's Right. It would be their second million-selling disco record. This one from May into June of 1976 would hit number 2 on the charts and be another classic early disco record. Although, after that year, by 77, they were pretty much forgotten. Next, number 77, we have the Beatles and Let It Be. Yes, the final album. Although it was completed before Abbey Road was completed, it was kind of pushed aside. They kind of weren't, the band was not happy with the sound on certain songs and kind of thought they could do it better. So then after Abbey Road was recorded and released, the band was pretty much splintering apart. Breakup was inevitable. They ended up bringing in Phil Spector to go over the tapes of the Let It Be album and see if he could make it a little bit better. He did upgrade the sound in some ways, but did some things that especially Paul McCartney didn't agree with in terms of orchestration and choruses of singers, especially on like The Long and Winding Road. He did not like how that came out, even though that ended up being a number 1 hit as well in 1970. Let It Be kind of was remixed, took a little bit of the George Harrison guitar edge off the song. And the band overall really were not thrilled with it, but Apple Records was about to was falling apart, and the group Paul was officially about to announce he's out of the band. So they put the record out, and whatever happened. Ended up that Let It Be ended up being a huge hit, going in number 1 for 2 weeks in April into May of 1970. So then Let It Be is number 77 for the decade of the 70s. Okay, next we have number 76, Starland Vocal Band, An Afternoon Delight from July 1976. Long story short, Starland Vocal Band was discovered by John Denver. And he it started a label, Windsong Records, which was an offshoot of RCA. The Starland Vocal Band was signed to Windsong. Put out this record. No matter what you think about it, I think it's horrendous garbage. But it hit number 1. Obviously, they would never have another hit. They were very much the one-hit wonder. And they won the Grammy for Best New Artist, so that was the ultimate hex on them. So they were doomed. They never had another hit, obviously. Alright, but that was a big one, though. Afternoon Delight. You have to give them that. Hey, for 2 weeks, they were on top of the world. Alright. Next, number 75, we have Melanie in Brand New Key. December 1971. Very much a very early 70s kind of folky, whimsical kind of song that ended up catching fire, and she spent 3 weeks at number 1, and was hot for probably that next 6 months, had a couple of hit records after that, and then faded out. But yeah, a fun, interesting little tune. Indeed. Alright, next we have number 74. It's the Four Seasons in December 1963. Oh, what a night. This was one of those acts that were huge in the 60s, kind of faded out once the British invasion started, and then once that was over and we went into the 70s, a lot of these acts had revivals. And I'm happy to see Frankie Valli and the boys get out there and have some hits again. Frankie Valli, of course, at first had a couple of big solo hits, with My Eyes Adored You and Swearing to God. And then at the end of 1975, the group reformed. It was basically him with all new members. Put out the album Who Loves You. The title track ended up being a big hit, going to number 3 in the fall of 75. And then December 1963, Oh What a Night was even bigger, going to number 1 for 3 weeks in March of 1976. So it ranks at number 74 for the decade. Next, number 73, we have the Jackson 5 and Dancing Machine. Dancing Machine would be a big early disco tune. That would be a big record in the springtime of 1974. Peaked at number 2 on the charts, hit number 1 on the R&B chart, and spent a good run in the top 10. For that reason, it comes in here at number 73 for the decade of the 70s. Next, number 72, we have the Carpenters and Top of the World. Carpenters were the most successful act the first half of the 70s. And on the adult contemporary chart, were even more dominant. This would be their the second number one hit. It would have 3 other singles that reached number 2. So they were pretty big run. Well, there was Rainy Days and Mondays, Superstar, Hurting Each Other, and Yesterday Once More. There were 4 number 2s between Top of the World. Between Close to You and Top of the World. So they had a big run, big run, and this was one of their biggest. Okay. Next, number 71, we have Billy Preston and Will It Go Round in Circles. This hit number 1 in July of 1973. It would be his first number 1. He had a number 2 hit with Outer Space the year before in 72. It was very popular first as a session man who worked for a lot of big acts, including the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And then he ended up getting his own contract and only recording his own music and had a pretty good run. He would have another number 1 with Nothing from Nothing the next year in 1974. But this would be his biggest hit in the 70s, and it's number 71 for the decade. Next, number 70, we have The Stories and Brother Louie from August of 73. This was a New York band. Lead singer was Ian Lloyd, and basically this would be their only big hit, hitting the top 40, and would go all the way to number 1 for 2 weeks. He would end up doing session work later on in the decade, including for Foreigner. He sang background on their first 2 albums. But this was their big moment for The Stories at number 70 for the 70s. Okay, next we have number 69, Diana Ross and Love Hangover from May into June of 1976, a big early disco hit, and definitely pushed her in that direction. She didn't really record any disco before this song, so this was a big switch, which kind of had an effect on things that she would record later on, certainly. But this would be a big record. It kind of had a battled it out with Silly Love Songs by Wings for number 1. Wings won that war, but Diana Ross certainly won the battle, having her song in the top 5 for over a month. Okay. Next, number 68 for the 70s is Anita Ward and Ring My Bell, a one-hit wonder. Jumped right into the dead center of the disco craze in the summer of 79, hitting number 1 for 2 weeks in July, and would be her only top 40 hit, but it would certainly be a huge disco record, selling nearly 2 million copies in 1979. Alright, speaking of 2 million copies in 1979, another disco classic at 67, The Village People and YMCA. What can I say about YMCA? You all know the song. Especially anyone that's a New York Yankee fan. Village People were the Village People, and when disco was hot, they were hot as well. So this was a big record. January of 1979 was number 2 for 3 weeks. Okay. Next, number 66, George Harrison, the double-sided hit, My Sweet Lord and Isn't It a Pity. This would be the first single off the first album he would record after the Beatles' breakup. Funny thing is, he would be the first solo Beatle to hit number 1, as this would be on the top for 4 weeks, December 1970 into January 1971. Of course, there was one minor issue with My Sweet Lord. It sounded a hell of a lot like He's So Fine by Chiffons. And he ended up having to pay out a whole bunch of money for copyright infringement. Anyway, but it was definitely, My Sweet Lord's definitely a classic song. He could have just changed the melody a little bit. He wouldn't have gotten in trouble, but that's how it goes sometimes. Alright, next we have number 65, Cher and Half Breed. From October 1973, was number 1 for 2 weeks. It was her second number 1 solo hit after Gypsies, Tramps, and Thieves, and she would have another solo number 1 right after it, Dark Lady, and then would go about 24 years for her next number 1, which is Believe. But definitely in the 70s, she was very popular, mostly due to the TV show with Sonny. Yes, so Half Breed hit number 1 in October of 73. It was ranked number 65 for the 1970s. Next, number 64, we have Player and Baby Come Back. This was an LA band that got signed to RSO Records right at the time that the Gibbs and Eric Clapton were kings of that label, but Player would have basically one really good year. 1978, as Baby Come Back would be number 1 for 3 weeks in January of 78. Right around Saturday Night Fever era, so RSO Records was definitely dominant on the charts at that time. This was the big one for Player. They would have 2 more top 40 hits. They would hit the number 10 with This Time I'm In It For Love as the follow-up single. And then Prisoner of Your Love was about a number 25 hit or so towards the end of 78. But this was the big one, at number 64 for the 70s. Okay, next, number 63, we have England Dan and John Ford Coley, and I'd Really Love to See You Tonight. This would be their debut hit from the fall of 76. Hit number 2 around October, I think. Play That Funky Music was number 1 when this was number 2. This was also a very big adult contemporary hit, and England Dan and John Ford Coley would be pretty hot for the next few years and put out several other big hits. Okay, number 62, we have KC and the Sunshine Band, and That's the Way I Like It. The second number 1 in a row after Get Down Tonight would be a big record in November and December of 75. Would spend a total of 2 weeks at number 1. And would start them on a roll where they would have 3 more number 1 hits and a number 2 hit in the next few years, and would be one of the top disco groups. Okay, next, at number 61, we have the Commodores and 3 Times a Lady. The first number 1 for Lionel Richie and the Commodores. It would spend 2 weeks at number 1 in August of 1978, and would be a big R&B and adult contemporary hit as well. Okay, next we have number 60. It's Peaches and Herb with Reunited. May of 1979, spent 4 weeks at number 1. Was a follow-up to their disco hit Shake Your Groove thing, so they kind of showed a little versatility here, going from a disco classic into a classic love song, indeed. Anyone alive in 1979 know that song. Okay, next, number 59, Gladys Knight and the Pips, Midnight Train to Georgia. Number 1 hit October into November of 1973. Would be the biggest hit for Gladys Knight and the Pips in a time period where they had a huge run. They got very, very hot, especially right around the time period they left Motown and went to Buddha Records. They had hit With Neither One of Us, Wants to Be the First to Say Goodbye earlier in the year, going to number 2. And then they switched to a new label. This was the first single, would go to number 1. And then they would have a couple more big hits in 1974. So they had a pretty good run. They actually made a lot of TV appearances at the time. Gladys Knight was one of the fill-in hosts on the Midnight Special as well. So there was a lot going on with them, and this was the peak of their success, Midnight Train to Georgia. Okay, next, number 58. We have the Eagles and One of These Nights. This would be their second number 1 in that year after Best of My Love, and would be the lead-off single on that very successful album that would also have Lion Eyes and Take It to the Limit, and would be right before the release of their Greatest Hits album, which would be one of the biggest selling records of all time, as it turns out. But One of These Nights was a big record, kind of put them a little bit more into an almost R&B, funky kind of direction on this song, and it ended up working out very well for them, as they hit number 1 for a week in August of 75 and spent several more weeks in the top 5. Okay, next we have number 57. That's Jim Croce and Bad Bad Leroy Brown. That hit number 1 in July of 1973, 2 weeks at the top. Very, very big record. It looked like he was really on the way to becoming a big star for years to come, but sadly died tragically in a plane crash in September of 73. He would have another number 1 hit with Time in a Bottle in December, and would continue having a few more hits into 1974. He really was productive in his couple of years of recording. it's one of those what if things that are always pretty sad. What would he have done if he had still been around for years to come? He might have been a huge star for many, many years. But that's how it goes sometimes. It's Jim Croce at number 57. Next, number 56, we have Andy Gibb and Love is Thicker Than Water. This song hit number 1 in February of 1978. It was sandwiched in between Staying Alive and Night Fever. He had... Actually, I get that wrong. It was in between How Deep Is Your Love and Staying Alive for the Bee Gees. So he definitely was a big part of that run of Brothers Gibbs hits. It was the second number 1 after I Just Want to Be Everything, which we will hear later in this countdown. He had some famous session musicians on this album, namely Don Henley on drums and Don Felder on guitar. So they just happened to be, recording somewhere in the same studio in Miami as Andy Gibb and the Bee Gees were working. So they got in there and got involved on Andy Gibb's record, which is pretty interesting for sure. Okay. Anyway, let's keep going. Number 55, we have the Partridge Family, and I Think I Love You, from late 1970. It spent 3 weeks at number 1, spent several more weeks in the top 10, and did pretty well for a debut song for some fictional TV family group. As it turned out, they would have a couple more years and have several more hits, but the show would end up going off the air by the end of 1973. David Cassidy did have a little bit of a solo career as well, but this was the biggest moment, hitting number 1 with I Think I Love You. Okay, next, number 54, we have Chicago and If You Leave Me Now. That's from October 1976. It would spend 2 weeks at number 1, would be their first of 3 number 1 hits. They had Hard to Say I'm Sorry and Look Away in the 80s. But this was a big one. It was on the 10th out in the Chicago 10 album, and even though it got some criticism from those who look at them as more of a rock and roll kind of band instead of this soft pop balladeer, band which with Peter Cetera singing lead on everything kind of changed the band in that direction. Still think they were great. They were awesome, in my opinion, and they ended up being one of the most successful acts of the 70s. Whether they changed, their change in sound got a little too soft. On the charts, it was the best thing they ever did. Okay. Next, number 53, we have the Ohio Players and Love Roller Coaster. This would be their second number 1. They hit number 1 with Fire in February of 75. But this song, Love Roller Coaster, would hit number 1 in January of 76. Had a pretty decent run of hits at the time, kind of started fizzling out, though, within the next year or so. But this was a big one for them, at number 53 for the decade. Okay, number 52, we have Elton John and Benny and the Jets, from 1974. This would hit number 1 in, I think it would be April, and it was from the album Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, which was one of his biggest selling albums he's ever had. So he is number 52 on the list with this song. Okay, number 51, we have Johnny Taylor and Disco Lady. April, owned the charts in April of 1976. Would spend 4 weeks at number 1. And though he had several hits going all the way back to the late 60s, this would be the biggest hit he'd ever have, and is only top 10 on the pop chart. Disco Lady, number 51. So now we are halfway through the top 100 of the 70s. And those of you that have a good feeling in their heart for these songs in those years, it just gets better and better as we go through. So let's keep going now. Second half, number 50, we have Ray Stevens and The Streak. One of the legendary novelty song artists. Ray Stevens had hits going all the way back to the late 50s. But this would be the biggest hit he'd ever have. It was a second number 1. He hit with Everything is Beautiful in 1970. But this would be his biggest of all, and from May of 1974. Spending 3 weeks at number 1. Okay. Next, number 49, the Captain and Tennille with Love Will Keep Us Together. A big hit in 1975 would end up winning the Grammy for Record of the Year. Would be challenging two other songs for the top spot of the year for 1975. Love What Keeps Together hit number one in June and ended up spending 4 weeks at the top going into July. This would start them on a string of hits that would take them right through the rest of the 70s. They actually had a TV variety show for a short period of time. And a lot of their hits were written by Neil Sedaka and Howard Greenfield. It would have this, and Lonely Nights, Angel Face, and The Way I Want to Touch You. Well, actually, they didn't write that, but The Way I Want to Touch You, You Never Done It Like That was a Neil Sedaka song as well. So, and they didn't really write a lot of stuff, but they performed very, very well. As Daryl Dragon was actually a keyboardist in the studio band for the Beach Boys in the late 60s. And Toni Tennille did a lot of background singing in the early 70s. You may recognize her voice on some other songs, especially some Anne Murray songs, and there was a couple other artists that she sang background on in the early 70s. And then they ended up, they were a married couple, decided to record together, and they were pretty hot for a good 5 years. All right. Anyway, number 48, we have the Carpenters, and They Long to Be Close to You. Their first huge smash hit, going to number one for 4 weeks. In July of 1970. They, of course, were one of the biggest acts of the 70s, and the biggest act on the adult contemporary chart for at least the first half of the 70s. So there we are, number 48, the Carpenters. Okay, number 47, we have Carole King and the double-sided hit, It's Too Late, and I Feel the Earth Move. Yes, Tapestry, one of the biggest selling albums of the first half of the 70s, and basically was on the charts the whole first half of the 70s, and it was a big success for her. She would end up getting a Grammy for Record of the Year for It's Too Late, and of course Tapestry would win a Grammy as well, and it's just a huge run. It would end up being number one for 5 weeks, June into July of 71. Okay, next at number 46 we have the Manhattans and Kiss and Say Goodbye. This would be hit number one in July of 1976. This is a group that had recorded for over 15 years and just never had the big pop breakthrough until this song in 76. They would end up having another big hit called Shining Star in 1980. That was basically the only two big hits they would have. They would have a couple of minor hits after that. But the Manhattans were number 46 with Kiss and Say Goodbye. Okay, we have number 45, Elton John and Kiki D's duet, Don't Go Breaking My Heart. This actually would hit number one just after Kiss and Say Goodbye in August of 1976 and spent the month at number one. It would be the longest running number one for Elton John up until Candle to Win 1997. And would be a pretty big seller here and in the UK. But pretty much end his run of total 70s dominance, as it would he'd go down a little bit downhill after that for the next couple of years. But the run he had was just unbelievable up to that point. But that was like the exclamation point on the 70s run, that song. All right, next we have another double-sided hit, number 44, John Denver, I'm Sorry on the A side and Calypso on the B side. I'll explain what happened here. They released I'm Sorry as the A side originally in August of 75 and would rocket up the charts all the way to number one in September of 75. And what happened is Calypso started to get very popular, being flipped over and played on the radio a lot as the B side. So RCA Records decided once I'm Sorry dropped out of number one, Calypso became the A side, and as advertising it as Calypso being the single, it would hang on near the top of the charts. Would spend 4 more weeks at number two as Calypso with I'm Sorry on the B side. So it ended up being combined an even bigger hit. It would be the last number one, that he would have. But he had a great run up to that point. There was another artist that kind of like at the last big hit, and it would start to slide downhill a little bit as the times started to change and the focus of easy listening shifted from the Carpenters and him to Barry Manilow and Captain and Tennille mostly in the late 70s. That's pretty much that point, when things started to switch. But for the time, it was a big, big record. Calypso is a tribute to Jacques Cousteau. Beautiful record, indeed. So, he ranked at number 44 for the decade of the 70s with I'm Sorry. All right, now, number 43, we have Tony Orlando and Dionne, and Knocked Three Times. This would be their first big, big hit, as they would have other hits afterwards, namely Tie Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree, and He Don't Love You Like I Love You, and, things like that. Say, Has Anybody Seen My Sweet Gypsy Rose? And other songs like that. But this was their first real big record, going to number 1 for 3 weeks in January of 1971. Okay, next, number 42, we have Simon and Garfunkel and Bridge Over Troubled Water. This would be a big, big record in 1970, spending 6 straight weeks at number 1. March into April, would get knocked out of number 1 by Let It Be. This was the lead-off single of what was at the time their last album, as they would split apart soon afterwards, and do an occasional concert here and there, an occasional song here and there afterwards. But this was the lead-off of the last big album, and of course this is an all-time classic song. Won the Grammy for Record of the Year for 1970. So that's number 42. Okay, number 41, we have Terry Jacks and Seasons in the Sun. Big number 1 record that he originally wrote for the Beach Boys, but they decided not to pass on it. So he ended up recording it himself, and he took it all the way to number 1 for 3 weeks in March of 1974. It was the number 2 single of 1974, only Barbra Streisand's The Way We Were was bigger. We'll get to that later in our countdown. Okay, number 40 of the 1970s. KC and the Sunshine Band and Shake, 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 Shake Your Booty. Their third number 1 single. And this would be in September of 1976. And they were a red-hot Miami disco band. And as I mentioned earlier, they ended up having 3 more million-selling hits after this song. And it was definitely the right time to be in the disco scene, because the great songs were all going to the top of the charts. Okay, number 39, we have Donna Summer and Bad Girls. Big, big record, spending 5 weeks at number 1 in July into August of 1979. Very much the tail end of the disco craze, as we were about to get the Disco Sucks promotion would happen, as this was number 1. And then a little song called My Sharona would suddenly dominate the charts and change the sound on the radio a little bit. That's for certain. But for this moment, Donna Summer was still the queen of the charts. Absolute queen. Bad Girls was number 39 for the decade. Okay, next, number 38, we have Don McLean and American Pie. 1972, 4 weeks at number 1. The song basically is a history of everything that happened the last, say, 10 years up to that point in time. It was a great history lesson and kind of poignant in a way that for a lot of people, the dream, of the 60s, the dream of the hippies movement was kind of dashed by that point in time. But an outstanding song indeed by Don McLean. American Pie, a whole 8.5 minutes, was number 38 for the 70s. Next, at number 37, we have Elton John and Crocodile Rock, his first number 1 hit from early 1973. It would spend 3 weeks at number 1 and start him on a huge run of success by one of the most successful performers of the 70s and of all time. Okay. Number 36, we have Eddie Kendricks, Keep On Truckin'. November 1973, it spent 2 weeks at number 1, was his first and only number one solo hit after leaving the Temptations in 1971. He would also hit with Boogie Down, which would be a big number two hit. The follow-up, which would be the follow-up single in February 74. But Keep On Truckin' was his big one. And 73 was definitely a good year for Motown when you include Stevie Wonder and Diana Ross in the mix of hits from that year. Okay, next, number 35, we have the Elton John Band and Philadelphia Freedom. Hit number one in April of 1975 and hung around top 10, top 20 for another 2 months afterwards. Big record, tribute to Billie Jean King in a way. The song was basically written about her and about tennis. The Philadelphia Freedoms was a tennis team in a tennis league that was had started up around that time. And very much also a tribute to the Philly sound, especially the spinners. It seemed the drum beat and the melody was very much an early 70s, disco kind of thumper. And he did a very, very good job. And for someone who wasn't really a disco artist, he kind of did a very respectable job of recreating that sound. And it was a big record, number one for 2 weeks. So that's number 35. Next, number 34, another disco classic, A Taste of Honey and Boogie Oogie Oogie. September 1978. Couldn't get this song off the dance floor or off the radio. Taste of Honey were Washington, D.C. R&B group. They would have a couple more disco-sounding hits after. Weren't big pop hits, though. In 1981, they changed direction, did a remake of Sukiyaki, Q Sakamoto, a Japanese song that would end up being number 3 in 1981. And then that would be pretty much the end of the road for A Taste of Honey. But this was the big one. Boogie Oogie Oogie went platinum, sold 2 million singles in 1978. Okay, number 33, we have the biggest hit ever for Barry Manilow, I Write the Songs. Reached number one in January of 1976, was number one for a week, and spent 4 more weeks at number 2 on the charts. So it was a big record, sold nearly 2 million copies. It was pretty much his main biggest hit, though he had Mandy and Looks Like We Made It in Copacabana, for sure. Other big hits, which helped him rank as the top adult contemporary act of the second half of the 70s. And I Write Songs was the big one. It was written by Bruce Johnston of the Beach Boys. Kind of, in a way, indirectly a tribute to Brian Wilson. But Barry changed the arrangement a little bit, turned it into more of the, big booming, creative, dramatic ending kind of songs, which he was known for. But that was his biggest hit, number 33. Next, number 32, Rod Stewart, double-sided hit, Maggie May, with Reason to Believe on the B-side. Maggie May would be the first huge record for Rod Stewart, going to number one for 5 weeks, would own the charts the month of October 1971. Actually, Reason to Believe was released as the A-side originally, was kind of stalling a bit on the charts, and some enterprising DJs flipped it over and said, "Oh, what's this song?" Maggie May played it and fell in love with it, and so did everybody else in the world, basically, in 1971. Okay, next on the list, another Rod Stewart song at number 31, Do You Think I'm Sexy? Would go to number one for 4 weeks, February 1979. Continued a run of the disco craze at that time. Basically got the idea when he heard the Rolling Stones go to number one with Miss You, which was a very disco song. Decided to record one of his own, and took off. It sold 2 million copies and was a worldwide smash. Okay, we're in the top 30 now. Number 30 for the 70s. I'm going to say this now. I hate this song. Despise this song. Can't stand this song. Don't ever want to play it again or hear it again. But in 1976, it hit number one for 2 weeks in November. Rick Dees and his Cast of Idiots and Disco Duck. Number 30 for the decade was number 5 for 1976. Oh, don't get me started. Let's just go to the next one, all right? Number 29. Barbra Streisand and Evergreen, Love Theme from A Star Is Born. Spent 3 weeks at number 1. It was a big record in March of 1977. She seemed to have a thing with movie songs, as The Way We Were was a huge record a couple of years, 3 years earlier. This would be a big hit in 77. She was in the movie with Chris Christopherson, and when she had her success in the 70s, she definitely did. You can't ignore what she did. She was big on the charts. All right. Next, number 28, the Jackson 5 and I'll Be There. Their biggest hit from 1970 would spend 5 weeks at number 1, mostly October into November of 1970. Fourth number 1 hit in a row out of the box for them. It was a big year for Motown, certainly, mostly because of them. So number 28 for the decade is I'll Be There. Next, number 27, we have Exile and Kiss You All Over. 1978 was a big, big record, spending 4 weeks at number 1. If it wasn't for the Gibb family, it would have been the number 1 song of 1978. But it was number 5. Because as you'll see, the top 4 of 1978 were all in one family. But big, big record for Exile. If this is your only top 20 hit you ever have, it's a good song to have, I think. Okay. Next, number 26, Glenn Campbell and Rhinestone Cowboy would spend 2 weeks at number 1 in September of 75, and according to our rankings, was the number 1 single of 1975, just beating out Philadelphia Freedom and Love Will Keep Us Together. Glenn Campbell's big run, he was a huge session musician in the 60s. He was toured with the Beach Boys for about a year and a half. And then started recording his own stuff, and it seemed to be one really great song after another in the late 60s. Then kind of faded out in the early 70s, was not doing much, and then 1975, dynamite hit, Rhinestone Cowboy. Number 26. Okay, number 25, we have Roberta Flack in The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face. Big, big number 1 record, 6 weeks at number 1 in April into May of 1972. Would win the Grammy for Record of the Year that year, and which she would end up doing 2 years in a row as Killingly Softly, which we'll talk about in a moment, was also a Grammy winner for Record of the Year. So that's number 25, Roberta Flack. Next, at number 24, Gilbert O'Sullivan, Alone Again Naturally. This song would just barely nose out The First Time Ever I Saw Your Face for number 1 single of 1972. This would hit number 1 for 6 weeks as well. This would be August into September of 1972. Gilbert O'Sullivan's first big hit. He would hit with Claire a few months later, would go to number 2, and have another top 10 hit, Get Down, in 1973. Very successful Irish recording act for a few years. Okay. Number 23, we have Paul McCartney and Wings and My Love. This would be his second solo number 1 hit after the Beatles, after Uncle Albert and Edmund Halsey. This would be a big one, going for number 1 for 4 weeks in June of 73. And it was kind of in the middle of a big run of hits that would go for a decade. Obviously, Paul McCartney, the most successful solo Beatle. This was a big record for him. Next, at number 22, Three Dog Night and Joy to the World. 6 weeks at number 1 in June of 1971. Would be ranked the number 1 single of 1971. And a very underrated group who had a huge number of hits in a row throughout the whole first half of the 70s. Has not gotten even one iota of a thought of getting into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I'm one of those who believe they should at least get nominated, but that's a whole nother story for another video. Next, number 21, we have B.J. Thomas and Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head. This would be ranked the number 1 single of 1970, would be the first number 1 single of the 1970s, spending the whole month of January, well, the first 4 weeks of January at number 1. Okay, Next, number 20, Gloria Gaynor and I Will Survive. Classic disco song. 3 weeks at number 1. I think about another 3 to 4 more weeks at number 2. Early in 1979. Big record. Originally, it was the B-side of a song called Substitute. Substitute barely hit the charts. Some DJ in a club turned it over and heard I Will Survive and absolutely freaked. I made sure every other DJ around knew about the song. And it spread like wildfire everywhere and became the classic it became. So that's number 20. Next, number 19 of the 70s, Walter Murphy and his Big Apple Band and The Fifth of Beethoven. This song would have a long chart run, would hit debut on the charts in May of 76, would not get to number 1 until October of 76. Big disco records, kind of, one of those novelty disco records, kind of like Disco Duck, one of the songs it was battling with at the top of the charts in the fall of 76. But a one-hit wonder and a disco classic. Okay, number 18, we have Barbra Streisand and The Way We Were. That song hit number 1 in 1974. It spent 3 weeks at the top. Would end up being ranked the number 1 song of 1974. Big record. It was a big upset that year in the Grammys as Olivia Newton-John's I Honestly Love You beat it out for record of the year at the Grammys. But definitely a song that makes you think about that year. You think of 1974, you think of The Way We Were. All right. Next, number 17, we have The Emotions and Best of My Love, their biggest record by a mile, going at number 1 for 5 weeks. Was battling it out with Andy Gibbs' I Just Want to Be Your Everything for number 1 on the charts, August and September of 77. By a little bit, Andy Gibbs won this battle, but The Emotions definitely had a huge record here. It was a platinum selling single, 2 million copies. They would, of course, perform with Earth, Wind & Fire on Boogie Wonderland, would have that hit a couple years later, and also they sang background on Let's Groove as well, but that wasn't really credited in 81. But The Emotions had a good run of R&B hits for certain. Okay, next at number 16, we have Roberta Flack and Killing Me Softly with his song. Yes, she did this song first. And had a huge success with it, going to the number 1 for 5 weeks. Would be, according to Billboard, I think it would be the number 3 or number 4 single of the year. I think it would be the number 3 single of the year. I know some other places had it ranked as the number 1 single of the year. But it was a big record indeed. The second year in a row with a Grammy. And actually, it could have been 3 years in a row. I thought the song Feel Like Making Love in 74 was a fantastic song. Just the title may have been a little too forward for its time. All right, next. Number 15, we have The Knack and My Sharona, the song I talked about, the song that kind of broke up the disco dominance in 1979. Knack was a new group. This was their first album. This was their first single, and it just took over, spending 6 weeks at number 1. It owned August and September of 1979. Okay, number 14, we have Wild Cherry and Play That Funky Music. This was an Ohio white R&B band. I know that made some people on some reaction videos like, wait a minute, they're white. Love it, I love it. But at the time, this was, who cared? It was just a great funky song. Spending 3 weeks at number 1 in 1976. Late September into October. But great classic indeed. All right, number 13 of the 70s, Carly Simon and You're So Vain. Early 1973. This was a song that kind of moved her a little bit more in the not so soft rock direction. This basically, a lot of the idea behind this song was Mick Jagger telling her, "Hey, you're not just a soft rock person. You could be more than that. Your songwriting supports you to be a more well-rounded pop artist, and you should do a song like this." And he actually sing background on it for her, and ended up being her biggest hit, going to number 1 for 3 weeks. Okay, number 12, Donna Summer and Hot Stuff, 1979 once again. The year, a huge, humongous year for Donna Summer, as she would have 3 number 1s and a number 4 hit, Heaven Knows, and have big hits right at the end of 78 and have a big hit early in 1980. She was on a roll. And unfortunately, disco was about to start sliding down the drain. But at the time, she was the queen of the charts. And Hot Stuff was a big record. Number 1 for 3 weeks, about 4 more weeks at number 2. Okay, number 11 of the 1970s, the Bee Gees and Stayin' Alive. The song that kind of started the explosion of Saturday Night Fever and disco. And it took disco to that stratosphere that we're talking about, that was coming down from when Donna Summer was hot. The Bee Gees just found the right thing at the right time, and they were the hottest thing in the world. And Barry Gibb was the biggest songwriter in the world at the time. But anyway, so it spent 4 weeks at number 1, and it spent 6 more weeks at number 2. So it had a big stranglehold on the top of the charts. It was number 11 for the 70s. All right, number 10. Speaking of strangleholds, Andy Gibb's Shadow Dancing, number 10 for the 70s, would spend 7 weeks at number 1, would own July, going into August of 78. Written by Barry Gibb. And Andy Gibb, if he was, wasn't number 1, the Bee Gees were. That was the kind of time period, those 2 years specifically, 77 and 78. It was a great time to be a Gibb. Next, number 9, we have Tony Orlando and Dawn and Tie a Yellow Ribbon Round the Old Oak Tree. Big record in 73, would spend 4 weeks at number 1. A lot of soldiers coming home from Vietnam kind of took the theme of the yellow ribbon around the tree and made it their own. The original song was about a guy coming out of prison that said, I'll be on the bus coming back home. If I don't see a ribbon on that tree, I'm not coming home. That means you don't want me to come back. Same theme. They kind of took that theme with Vietnam and kind of ran with this song, and ended up making this song an even bigger hit, being it was a number 2 song of 1973. Okay, number 8 of the 70s, the Bee Gees again with Night Fever. This would spend 8 weeks at number 1. Would own basically April and May, early part of May 1978, and they would show the peak of their dominance, as Stayin' Alive would be number 2 through most of those weeks. So it was definitely Saturday Night Fever time, and it reflects on this decade chart very well. All right, number 7, Marvin Gaye and Let's Get It On. Very much the peak of his career was this time period from 67 to 73. And this was a huge record. It just beat out Tie a Yellow Ribbon for number 1 for 1973. And as I mentioned earlier, it was still a very good time period for Motown in terms of artists having a lot of hits. So that's that. Next, number 6 of the 1970s, Wings and Silly Love Songs, would be the number 2 single of 1976. On some charts, it's number 1. Depends on if you consider Tonight's the Night a 76 or a 77 hit. We'll get into that when we get to that song. But the Silly Love Song spent 5 weeks at number 1. Would be the biggest hit for Wings, although Paul McCartney would have a couple of hits that spent a few more weeks at number 1 than 5. But a big record indeed in 1976. Okay. Number 5 of the 70s, Andy Gibb and I Just Want to Be Your Everything. His first solo hit in the USA, would spend 4 weeks at number 1, several more weeks at number 2 or 3, and was a big record for 1977. We'd also have Don Henley on drums and Don Felder on guitar. So you can say he had about 40% of the Eagles in his band, which isn't bad. It's a pretty good session band. All right. Next, number 4, the Bee Gees and How Deep Is Your Love? The song that started the whole Saturday Night Fever insanity, as this would spend 3 weeks at number 1 and a total of 17 weeks in the top 10, which was a record at that time. Also 26 weeks on in the top 40, which is a very long time, exactly 6 months. Big record, big ballad. It was number 1 on the Old Contemporary chart as well. And the Brothers Gibb, biggest hit by the Gibb in the Gibb family in the decade. Okay, top 3, my friends. Number 3, Chic and Le Freak. 6 weeks at number 1, December 78. Up it was non-consecutive, so kind of slipped down to 2, slipped down behind You Don't Bring Me Flowers, jumped back into number 1, slipped down behind Too Much Heaven by the Bee Gees, jumped back into number 1 again. So, big record. Number 1 single of 1979 overall. And for those of you who don't know the story of the song, it's about the band coming to Studio 54 a year earlier, end of 77, as a guest of Grace Jones, and the bouncers would not let them in. Not knowing that they had already had a hit on the charts, Dance, 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 Yowza, Yowza, Yowza was on the charts. And now Rogers just said, F off. And he got home and was playing and had that in his head, F off, and became a loop in his head and turned it into a melody, and obviously knew that F off was not going to get on the radio. So he changed it to Freak Out, and the rest is history, as it turns out. And it would be the biggest hit, going to number 1. All right, number 2 of the 1970s. We're there. Rod Stewart's Tonight's the Night, Gonna Be Alright was the number 2 song of the 1970s. Would spend a total of 8 weeks at number 1, would hit number 1 in November of 76, and would go stretch all the way until the first week of January 1977. So now the whole controversy is, do we count it as a 76 hit, or do we count it as a 77 hit? If we count it as a 76 hit, it's number 1 for 76. If we count it as 77, it's number 2 for 77. Because number 1 on our countdown is also from 77. So, anyway. But that was the biggest hit for Rod Stewart, by far. Although, Do You Think I'm Sexy and Maggie May were big too. So, give him credit. He had a good 70s. Really did. Alright. Now, speaking of good 70s, this is the opposite of good 70s. This is the only top 40 hit this artist ever had. Was in the shadow of her father, who was a soft rock guy in the 50s. A song that a lot of people, that was such a big hit that people were despising the song by the end of the chart run, including me. I didn't want to hear this song anymore. I was thanking the Lord that Saturday Night Fever came along and took over everything, because it pushed this song off the radio finally. I am talking about Debbie Boone, New Light of My Life, the number 1 song of the 1970s, 10 straight weeks at number 1, October to December 1977. Ugh. Do I hate it more than Disco Duck? No. I don't hate any song more than I hate Disco Duck. But You Light of My Life, enough. It was like, yuck already. So, tell you how I really feel. That's what I do on this channel. Those that don't know that already. But there we go. The top 100 songs of the 1970s. I hope you enjoyed this countdown. It's sad that I can't really play any of these songs because the copyright gods are ready to strike me down off the mountaintop with laser beams. Strike 1, strike 2, strike 3. Yeah? I don't want that to happen. So I'll just talk about the songs. And show you a picture of the record label. It's about all I can do for now. But I hope you enjoyed this. Please share. Please subscribe. Please like the video. And I'm going to push up. I'm going to do some more kind of like reaction videos. I'm going to do more of those. So keep this thing rolling. Thank you all for watching. Peace and love.